greatest thing since sliced bread should be turned into the greatest thing since German bread, because it is definitely ingrained in German culture and a very important part of it. And in this short presentation, I'm going to try to show some of the aspects characterizing this very impressive bread culture to be found in Germany. So in 1792, for example, the great author Goethe wrote that white and black bread is actually the Shibboleth, the battle cry between Germans and French. He was trying to make a point here, highlighting the cultural differences in the tradition of baking, and he used this very interesting word, Shibboleth, meaning not only the spikes of the corn, but also it is a reference in the Bible to some kind of code, a code word that only worked for people who were able to pronounce it correctly, but foreigners couldn't only pronounce it in a distorted way because of the dialect. So the dark rye bread mentioned here by Goethe is somewhat characterized as the specifically German dialect in this broad field of bread preparation, and Goethe observed how people are immediately either obsessed with it or disgusted with this particular type of bread dialect, as was the case with the French, who totally preferred a different type than the ones the Germans had offered them. Well, rye bread is seen usually as the most prominent feature of this German bread culture, but it is in no way the only type characterizing this baking traditions. The diversity of types of bread in Germany is unparalleled anywhere in the world. There are currently over 3,200 different bread specialties in the German bread register, and you won't find these anywhere else. So if you ask about the reasons for this great diversity, you will have to delve a little bit deeper in history, because no matter how unquestionably the great affective attachment of the Germans have to the specialties of black bread, it is just as difficult to actually explain this situation. So only in historical retrospect can a number of different lines of tradition in baking can be traced, which may have led to the uniqueness of German bread and its diversity. But let's talk a little bit in a more general manner about bread. So since food is a prerequisite for the existence of all living things, people have always used a lot of intuition and observation in order to find and prepare food. So at the very early stage in human history, it was discovered that crushed and soaked grain, for example porridge, is more nutritious and digestible than the raw grain, and later it was all about perfecting the production for the purpose of making work easier, but above all else about increasing the enjoyment of this food and its nutritional value. So we can notice countless development steps in the form of larger or smaller inventions, all of which can no longer be completely understood today, but were necessary in order to achieve the progress recognizable nowadays, even if we can no longer properly assess the importance of it. So in the past, basically advances were not made as quickly as in the last, let's say, 200, 150 years, but they were nevertheless the basis for the great technical revolution in the 19th and 20th century. This also applies to grain processing, and let's look a little bit into this. So Egypt brought in the 3rd millennium BC the first, let's say, high culture of bread. There were numerous groundbreaking developments taking place here and there, and they have been handed down to us in different sources. So crushing grain, for example, is mentioned with the help of a mortar, grinding between two stones, drying porridge or dough using solar energy to preserve it, baking in hot ash and embers, the first known ovens in various shapes, baking in heated clay pots, and the discovery of dough leavening, which made it possible to produce fluffy pastry for the first time. Germanic peoples also had a say in the story in that they invented pretty much the tunnel oven, which heated directly like its predecessors. So you had fire in the vault directly, and baking took place in the radiated heat. And the earth oven, on the other hand, was widespread in another part of the world, in the Arab world. So coming a little back in time in the Neolithic age, so we're talking approximately 1800 BC, outside of the advanced cultures of Egypt and Mesopotamia, so-called baking plates made out of clay were used to produce flat cakes, although this name is kind of incorrect because it's not really a baking process but rather a drying one. A further development taking place mainly in Eastern and Southeastern Europe was the baking bell, and we have the Romans to thank for further developing the oven into some kind of dome shape on a substructure. Basically, the entire Middle Ages stopped at this technological level. The directly heated so-called tunnel oven or Old German oven or the breast firing oven corresponded in principle to the Roman dome oven. It was the only type of oven that existed both as a home one and as a more, let's say, commercial furnace. So to put it simply, the principle was that a fire was kindled on the hearth, which heated both the hearth itself and the vault, and after the embers and ash had been removed, the pieces of dough were pushed into the baking chamber, and the hearth from below and the vault from above gave off the heat required to bake the baked goods. The so-called Perkins heating tube was something patterned in 1836 but not used until about 20 or 30 years later. This was the true future-oriented solution for changing the baking technology. A combi steam oven was developed, an indirectly heated baking chamber that was continuously charged. And after 1890, the company called Werner and Federer Stuttgart was able to build functional steam furnaces in Germany and Austria, which were then continuously developed and improved in the years to follow. And due to this technical superiority over conventional ovens, they quickly established themselves in many European countries and remain dominant for more than 60 years. Bakeries that owned a steam oven or furnace called themselves steam bakeries, which was a term to indicate the progressive attitude of the baker and the particularly good quality of the baked goods. With more than 3,200 different bread specialties in the German bread register, we can say that Germany is the world champion of bread. No other country offers such an amount of variety and quality. There is a difference, basic distinction made between leavened and unleavened bread, and there is also a distinction between the types of bread according to the mixing ratio of wheat and rye flour. So for example, rye breads, they have at least 90% rye content. This is the so-called pumpernickel, and then we have mixed rye breads with a percent varying between 50 and 89 rye content, and mixed wheat bread with 50 to 89 wheat content, and wheat bread with at least 90% wheat content. But it's not the single aspect of the story. There are also numerous special breads. So for example, breads made from special flours like Steinmetz, Schlüter, Klopferbrot. There are breads with special dough processes like Graham, Losbrot, breads with special additives such as multigrain breads, and breads with added sprouts and seeds like wheat germ and malt breads, breads with added oil seeds, breads with other additives such as raisins or spices, diet breads like protein enriched, energy, carbohydrate reduced breads, subject to special labeling regulations. And we also have gluten-free bread, diabetic bread, low sodium, low salt bread, also subjected to the dietetic foods regulation. Each of these types of bread can be varied in many ways through the degree of grinding of the flour, the dough process, which affects the bread volume, crust, crumb structure, taste, namely the direct yeast process, the pre-dough process, the 1, 2, or 3 stage sourdough production, combined yeast sourdough production, soaking, breakfast pieces production for whole meat bread, for example, as well as different types of preparation that give the bread different characters. So you can have long and round loaves of bread, you can have so-called bread with crust on the sides in the style of the Kasseler, for example, Paderborn bread, specialties such as barley bread, netted bread, other regional breads. And according to the surface of the loaves, there is a distinction between the plain and the floured loaves. If loaves of bread show patterns on the surface, it is an indication that the pieces of dough were lying in a basket during final proofing. The temperature profile during the baking process plays as well an important role in bread quality, as in high initial temperatures lead to a thick crust, which results in a strong bread taste, wood-fired bread. The variety of all these bread types is matched only by small baked goods, especially rolls and small loaves. And there is also a distinction to be made here between Kaisersemmel, for example, the rolls or the slice rolls like Sternsemmel, the round pieces, the croissants, pretzels, and much more. And fine baked goods are also a part of the range of German bakeries. Their diversity is so great there that they can hardly be divided into groups. And the guidelines for fine baked goods from 1915 described them as containing ingredients that help determine the nutritional value and sensory properties, namely at least 10% of their weight, fat or sugar. They usually also contain one or more ingredients such as milk or eggs, raisins, currants, candied fruit, chocolate, icing, almonds, hazelnuts, walnuts, and anything you could imagine. Other ingredients that give the product the name are used in such quantities that the special properties intended by their use clearly appear in the case of the product. Features of a sensory nature and value determining in those of a nutritional or physiological nature. Special assessment criteria, in other words, apply to them. This is by no means an exhaustive description of the diversity. And finally, this diversity, which is more pronounced in Germany than in other European countries, has at least two causes. On the one hand, we have the podological and climate conditions, and on the other hand, we have the special development of the form of government of German territories. So in the true sense of the word, the nature of the existing soil is absolutely fundamental to grain cultivation. Traditionally, that means since the 6th, 5th century BC, in addition to wheat, rye was mostly cultivated in German German territories, which grows better on sandy soils in a cooler climate than, let's say, towards the south, the Alps, where almost exclusively wheat was being cultivated, in Swabia, for example. This is no longer the case today, but as late as 1872, in a popular work called The Whole of Agriculture, rye is categorically considered the main breadbasket of the northern countries and the sandy soil. An older differentiation of the bakers' guilds into solid bakers and loose bakers fits in with this finding. This means that the former process the solid rye dough, whereas the latter process the loose wheat dough, with Upper Saxony and the rest of the Reich only having loose bakers. Whereas in Lower Saxony, Westphalia, and the Nordic kingdoms, there were predominantly solid bakers. In a few imperial cities in Lower Saxony, there were both guilds side by side, and this pretty much marks the border to the actual black bread country. From a cultural point of view, the notorious small state system of the older empire was perhaps more important. Already under the later Staufer, and then especially in the period without an emperor after the deposition of Emperor Friedrich II in the 13th century, the process of centralizing state power, which had already begun, had hardly begun, came to a standstill in contrast to France, England, or Spain, and the leaders of the powerful tribal duchies extended their autonomy in some cases to the point of complete autonomy. At about the same time, the large number of newly founded cities, often in alliance with the emperor, established their independence from the respective sovereigns and a correspondingly local character in customs and style. So this means it would have also encompassed the bread culture, changing from city to city and from landscape to landscape. Recently, this historically based diversity has experienced a new boost, this time fueled above all else by the increasing competition in an increasingly hard-fought market. The relatively large number of bakeries of all shapes and sizes in the country that fiercely compete with each other are forced to be inventive. A very efficient supplier industry continually makes suggestions to its customers for new types of bread, more and more delicious, and also baked goods in order to secure their own sales. Finally, we can also add here the comparatively good training of German bakers. However, this development of the baking industry has come under pressure lately due to changes in the labor market and to unfortunate economical conditions. Let's hope for the best in the future for the development, the continuous development of this tremendous industry. And if you haven't tried some of the German assortments of bread so far, I highly recommend you to do so. This is Irina. If you like my talks, just hit the subscribe button, help my channel grow, and help me produce more quality content in the future. All the best to you and enjoy your bread.